Some people think that the modern notion of race isn't something we've had for that long. But certainly breaking the world up into us versus them, and liking the us and really hating the them is natural. There's now tons of studies, including from babies, but also from young children, cross-cultural studies, computer simulations of biological evolution. If there's one thing we know, my field knows, it's that a propensity to break the world up into us versus them comes natural. So there's even these very clever studies. You get 100 people in a room, like you and me, and we all have a coin, and we all flip our coin. So roughly half is heads, half is tails, go into different parts of the room. Then we ask, so what do you guys think, your tails? What do you think of the tails group? You think we're smarter? Even putting myself aside, it so happens the tails group is smarter. The heads group, you seem to have like a bunch of dicks over there. Like who likes them? And even the most arbitrary ways of cutting us apart sets up psychological mechanisms where we split the world.
I'm joined by Professor Paul Bloom. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Been listening to a lot of your work recently, some fantastic interviews with Sam Harris, some podcasts that you did a little while ago, but some super interesting stuff. We've been talking about empathy and about resilience a lot on the show. Recently discussed Eliud Kipchoge's sub 2-hour marathon performance, which was a very resilient physical feat that people have seen. So we got a lot to delve into today, but how would you describe the work that you do if someone hadn't met you before and didn't know you?
So I'm interested I'm a psychology professor at Yale, and I'm interested in human nature. And so my work goes from topic to topic, and they're kind of related. Broadly, I'm interested in pleasure, what we like, why we like it. I'm really interested in morality. How do we explain our intuitions about good and evil? How do we explain our who we hate, who we admire? And what kind of moral judgments are good for us? Like, how should we think morally? And there my work kind of blends into philosophy. And that was my most recent book, Against Empathy. And I'm interested in a cluster of things. I'm interested in the self. I'm interested in how we think about things that aren't like us, like robots or non-human animals. Interested in religion, where religious belief comes from. Most recently, I've been interested in suffering. So I have a kind of dream job where I get paid perfectly fine to just ask some really cool questions, and my students and my colleagues work on them.
It must feel nice to be able to indulge your intellectual curiosity on a yearly basis and just keep on changing that up every so often.
Yeah, they haven't fired me yet, and it is very nice.
So you touched on a word there, morality, and I think a lot of the stuff that you're talking about are questions that people take for granted, or their appearance that is something that people just take as fact. Do you often find when you begin to look at the first principles or real strip things back to basics, do you find a bit of a disconnect, or people just looking at the questions that you're asking and thinking, oh, well, why are you asking that? Why are you asking what is morality? Or why are you asking what is empathy?
It's interesting. It's a good question. My work tends to fall into one of two extremes. So I'm sometimes interested in things that are honest to God puzzling for a lot of people. Like you ask people, what do people get out of sadomasochistic sex or hot saunas or watching movies that terrify them? And people say, I don't know, that's really cool that we do. But some of my questions, and this is what you're getting at, involve questioning things that we take for granted. And William James, a long time ago, a great psychologist, said, it's only to a scholar can you ask a question like, why do people get flushed when everybody's looking at them? Why do we get hungry when we smell something delicious? And these are questions like, why does the apple fall from the tree? You got to be in some way, step back and be a scholar and sort of say, well, okay, sure, that happens. That's obvious. But why do we work that way? And so for morality, if you right now, you walked outside and you saw somebody slapping a child, just beating the crap out of a 4-year-old, you would be shocked. You'd probably spring to action. Why? And it's not enough for you to say, well, of course, it's just natural, it's obvious. Okay, let's spell it out. What's bothering you? Can you imagine a person who would find this funny or have no interest at all? And those are sort of questions I ask.
Yeah, I imagine that must get you into some interesting situations, thinking about some of the people that I spend my time with and talking to. And every so often you posit a question or make a point about something, and half of the room sort of turns and looks and gives you this
Yeah.
sort of side eye.
Yeah. When they discover you're really not one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're sort of looking at things from the outside perspective in our business.
Yeah. I think to fly a flag for the outsiders, I definitely find those questions more interesting than not being able to look at them with perspective.
Yeah.
So let's talk about empathy. It's something that we've discussed recently on the podcast. I often use the cliche that I have a crippling level of empathy, but then I don't actually know if I do have a crippling level of empathy or if I have a crippling level of compassion. And I'd quite like to work out which one of those it is. So
some days I regret calling my book Against Empathy, because the word empathy has a lot of meanings, and I don't care what you call it. Like it's so if some people just take empathy to mean kindness or goodness, and I think everybody should be kind and good. And I don't think there's such a thing as a crippling level of goodness. You should be as maximally good as you can. That'd be great. You just to have a lot of goodness means you're a good person. But there's a set of more focused meanings that I'm more interested in. And one sense of empathy, which is what I'm targeting in my book, is putting yourself in another person's shoes, feeling what they feel, absorbing their pain. And a lot of people describe this as a very good thing. I actually think in many ways it could be a very bad thing. And you actually put your finger on one aspect of it, which is you look at the people who help other people face to face, day to day, people who work, firefighters, comps, nurses, doctors, shrinks, people who are ER workers. Here's what they have in common. They're pretty low empathy. They care about people. They understand people. They want to help people. But they could be with somebody who's screaming in agony, and they're cool with it. They don't feel it. And then they treat people for 9 hours, and then they go home with their family and they order sushi and they watch TV and they don't get upset. Now, if you have a crippling level of empathy, you could not do that. You may not last a week doing that because the pain of others might get to you too much. And so this is on way of answering your question, whether it's empathy or something else. So I'll ask you, if you with somebody who's very depressed or very upset or very angry, does that affect you in a way that you're not comfortable with?
Yes.
Then you have high empathy, my friend. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you keep it under wraps, but it means that there's certain things you probably are not as good at doing as other people would be. You would not do well as a therapist, because a therapist, you might spend 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day dealing with people who are anxious and depressed and weeping and deeply upset. And if you absorb their feelings, if you feel what they feel, you will be run through a ringer each day. So I have a friend of mine, and she's a shrink. And so she tells me she works like 50-minute session, pause, 50-minute session, pause, 50-minute. And I say, that must drive you up the wall dealing with those people who are so upset. And she says to me, no, I actually find it fascinating. I love solving their problems. I try to figure this out and everything. I find it exhilarating. And she's wired up differently than me. And it's why she can do the job and I can't.
What's your disposition?
Highly empathic in that way. And so in some way, when I talk about the problems of empathy and say there are better ways to do things, better ways to be good and getting caught up in the pain of others, to some extent, it's a sort of self-therapy thing. Like, I'm talking to myself here.
For a couple of 100 pages.
Yeah, well, I put in some jokes. I tell some stories. I mean, it's also just to make sure it's not. I don't want people to think my work is entirely self-therapy. It's that a lot of people, even people who aren't empathic, think that empathy is the way to go for morality. And I discuss in the book all sorts of reasons why not. So one is the reason that you raised, which is the extent of a personal connection, impairing your role as a helper. But the more general thing is that empathy is powerfully biased. We know this from everyday life. We know this from 1,000 experiments. So I'm looking at you, you're a guy is sort of same skin color, ethnicity as me, English speaker, similar background, whatever. So I could feel for you. You're my kind of guy. I could feel your pain. If I heard you were in trouble, I could get upset by that. That's how empathy works. But what if you were different? What if you were different skin color, different gender, you didn't speak English? What if you were disgusting in your front, like you were a homeless person or something you hadn't washed for a long period of time? What if you were frightening? All of those things shut down empathy. And so to the extent we can say intellectually, I think that a middle-aged white man from my city, his life matters just as much as somebody I will never see in sub-Saharan Africa. To the extent I could acknowledge that, it means I have to transcend empathy. Empathy pushes you to the close, to the similar, and as moral reflective beings, we say we could do better than that.
So what's a purer version of empathy, or what's a less biased version of empathy?
So I think by its very nature, empathy is biased. Empathy is impure. In some way, your question's like saying, I complain about racism, and you say, well, what's a purer form of racism? Well, racism...
Do not answer that, please.
Racism's going to be racism.
Yeah.
But I think the gist of your question is, what should we replace it with? And
correct.
So I had this book Against Empathy, and the subtitle is The Case for Rational Compassion. And so rational is part of it, which is that you should sort of, as you go through the world, if you're a country, if you're an industry, if you're an individual, and try to make the world better for people and use your head to do so. Try to figure out what's the best thing to do. But compassion is, I think, the answer to your question, which is you should care about people. You see this distinction in Buddhism. So Buddhism is very clear. It says, you want to be a good person, you want to be a helper. Don't get caught up in other people's pain. Instead, love them. Fill your heart with good cheer and happiness. You see these Buddhist monks, and they're radiating joy, even when dealing with people who are in horrible pain and live in squalor. And that's the way to do it. Compassion and love, but not empathy.
How do you define the specific differences then between empathy and compassion? Is it simply not putting yourself in somebody else's shoes?
That's at the core of it. So maybe here's a good example. Suppose we're really good friends and I'm anxious. I'm coming to you and I'm upset about something. I'm just anxious. I'm upset. Maybe I'm in tears and everything. If you were to feel empathy for me, you would feel my anxiety. You would share my anxiety with me and you would be anxious too. But if you were to feel compassion for me, you would see I'm in distress and you'd want to make my distress go away. And you'd want to help me. And this could lead to two very different responses. If you felt empathy, you'd kind of be there, maybe crying a little bit with me and so on, and it wouldn't make me any better. In fact, in some extent, it makes me worse. I now have two problems, not just one. But if you felt compassion for me, you might try to cheer me up. Or you say, dude, calm down, take a deep breath. It's not as bad. You would be a model for me with your calmness, with your authority. This is an old insight. What we want in friends, take sadness. What we want in friends is not somebody to multiply our sadness, but somebody to replace it with happiness. Now, I don't want to overstate this. There are things I think I wrote in my book that were a bit too strong. And I think there are some cases where we do want empathy. So a good example of this is anger. So suppose I come to you, my friend, and I'm furious at somebody. Said, this guy did this and he did that, and how could he treat me that way and everything? And I want you as a friend not to say, I really appreciate your perspective and I hope you calm down. I want you to say, he said that to you? Let's go to his house and beat the crap out of him. You get angry too. That's what pals do. If I'm watching a TV show and I'm really into it, I don't want you to sit there next to me. If you're sitting there, I want you to be into it too. I want us to share the feelings. And there's actually psychological work showing that just two people silently sharing each other's feelings while watching a movie or show and everything. There's a pleasure in that, and there's a connection in that. So I'm not against empathy in general. Empathy could do a lot for us. It could do a lot for relationships. It could be a great source of pleasure. But as a source, as a moral guide, who should I help? Who should our country go to war with and everything? It is, I think, very limited.
It strikes me that both empathy and compassion can't exist in isolation. If I was the only person on the planet and the planet was completely whitewashed except for me, is there such a thing as, well, I suppose there's self-compassion, but there's not such a thing as self-empathy, is there?
No, it's hard to imagine what it'd be to put yourself in your own shoes. It's kind of mental gymnastics is hard to imagine. You would, of course, feel much empathy and compassion for people, but they would just have to be from your imagination. People from your memories or people you imagine. And you know, if there's books left in this apocalyptic world, you could feel plenty of empathy for characters in books.
Yes.
For instance. And again, I think that, you know, I love stories and I read a lot, and the feeling of empathy in that sort of imaginative pleasure is super important. I wouldn't want to get rid of that.
It's what immerses you in the story, right?
Exactly. You know, there are other things that could immerse you in a story, but you know, often a story has an engaging character, and you put yourself in his or her shoes, and then you adopt their perspective, and you go through life as them. So, you know, I'm reading a Stephen King novel now, The Institute, and a lot of it is this boy who's trapped, who's kidnapped, and you really see the world through his eyes. Now, that's not such an interesting case. To me, the cooler case, and again, now this gets back to the problem of empathy, is that even a bad character, if you get connected with him, you could adopt his perspective. I don't know, you ever watch Breaking Bad or Sopranos?
Yeah.
So both of these shows at the core had Walter White, Tony Soprano, guys who are actually not good guys. You're not supposed to take them as like these wonderful superheroes to follow. But once you have them on the screen and you think about them and you get absorbed in them, all of a sudden their interests become your interests. There's no problem, you know. One of my favorite books is Lolita by Nabokov. You know, and the main character of that, Humbert, is a pedophile. He's a pedophile pursuing the affections of this young girl. But by the time you're 10 pages in the book, he's your guy. It's a first-person narrative. You're in this head. Part of you says, you know, this is wrong, but part of you cheers him on. And so a good storyteller can use empathy to cause you to have a connection with characters who are just awful.
And I suppose that manifests itself in the real world as bias.
Yes. All of this manifests itself as bias. As soon as one person steps out of a crowd and says, put yourself in my shoes, the whole world changes. And there's experimental research on this. So Dan Mattson, this great psychologist of empathy, has a study where he tells you about a little girl, and she needs an operation. And if she doesn't have an operation, then terrible things will happen to her. But she's on there's a lineup, a list, and she's low down on the list. And it's a fair list. Other kids are ahead of her. Should you move her up? And you say, no, if it's a fair list. But then he has a little twist. He says, try to feel what it's like to be her. Put yourself in her shoes. Now things flip, and you want to move her up the list. You know, I have 100 people applying for a job, and I'm looking at their files and and then one person comes up to me and says, let me tell you my story. And all of a sudden, that person, he or she is my person, even though the other 99 also had stories. It's just that by accident, the one who got to tell me theirs got to sway me. And I think that these things are morally corrosive. I think they're very natural, but the amount of bias they incur in the world is terrible. And it sets up empathy in a very tight connection with something like racism. I mean, whose stories are you likely to hear? Whose lives are you most likely to get connected with? Well, people around you, your group, your friends, your family. And those people are your psychologists call your in-group. Empathy favors the in-group. But as a moral person, you might say, look, even if somebody doesn't have the good fortune to be one of my friends or to look like me, still that person has as much moral value as anybody else. And that's what empathy misses.
It's totally removing rationality, isn't it? That rank order of whatever it is, first come, first serve, or people who need it the most out of a group of 100. Right. Did you have a look at how empathy and compassion would have been used evolutionarily by our ancestors? Did you think about that?
I did. It's a very interesting question. So the idea of caring for others, some sort of compassion for others, it used to be thought that this is crazy non-Darwinian. Like, why would we ever have that? And there's a great puzzle for Darwin. Like, if nature is red in tooth and claw, if the survival of the fittest, why would we ever care for another? It must be a miracle, some people said. Or other people say, we don't really care for other people. Can't, we're just cynics all the way down. But the neo-Darwinian view got really sophisticated about 100 years ago. And then people began to make sense over time of how you could evolve caring for others. So, for instance, one simple way is that if you take once with a genetic understanding, there's no hard and fast division between myself and my children, who share half my genes, and my siblings, who share half my genes, and my cousins and nieces and nephews, and so on, who share different fractions of my genes. So it behooves me from an evolutionary point of view to care about them as well, to really have them matter. So that's one thing. They call it kin selection. A second thing is sort of reciprocal altruism. So suppose you and I work well together. When we kill an animal that's too big for either one of us to bring back, we work together and bring it back. We do this repeatedly. We both gain from our interaction. Well, then it makes sense for me to care about you. And so these mechanisms, which aren't infinitely broad but specific, I think can help capture where compassion comes from. Empathy is a little bit different. Nobody really knows why we have empathy, feeling the pain, feeling the feelings of others. One theory is that it actually has to do with parenting. That your connection with your young child or your young baby helps if you have a truly empathic bond. And one reason to take this seriously is that the hormones that connect up with empathy are also involved in breastfeeding and childbirth.
Okay.
So empathy may be an adaptation for dealing with babies.
Have you defined how empathy physiologically manifests itself in someone then? You mentioned hormones there.
There's studies of hormones. There's a way in which hormones can elicit empathy and drive empathy. What's interesting is you get a dissociation with a separation from compassion. So for instance, if in some studies they raise people's empathy, but then these people become more racist. And there's no contradiction. When you raise people's empathy, you're not ratcheting up their goodness. What you're doing is you're making them more connected to those they're connected to. Well, by the by, they'll be less connected to those they're not connected to. There are studies, there are brain imaging studies, some lovely work done in Germany, where they get people to be empathic, to put yourselves in the shoes of others, or to get people to care about others. And these show very distinct neural profiles. So I think there's by now good reason to believe that empathy and compassion run on different brain circuitry, are connected to hormones in different ways, and are kind of separate. And this is important because if empathy and compassion were inextricably linked, then me telling you to give up on empathy would be kind of crap advice, because then you also wouldn't care about people at all.
So it's important for us to try and work out where the rubber meets the road between these two.
It really is. It's important for us. It's important for somebody like me as a psychologist to understand it. But it's important for everybody to realize as they make it through their regular life, where did their moral thoughts and feelings come from? If you say, same-sex marriage is horrible, it's an atrocity. And I say, no, it seems fine. It seems perfectly fine. I think each of us should be able to look and say, well, why do we feel that way? Where's our arguments? We should be reflective about these things. You think this is just what a sort of psychologist philosopher would say, but I think a lot of our moral instincts, let's do this, let's punish these people, let's reward these people, are based on sort of brain processes and psychological processes that if we reflect upon them, we wouldn't trust them as much.
There's a lot of things that people take for granted about our nature that, as you've identified, perhaps not even isn't optimal, is detrimental or is damaging. Mm-hmm. And I honestly do think that these sorts of questions, I can see how they're inflammatory. I can see how the suggestion that racism for someone who's empathic might actually be natural, that they have to work against that, because immediately it's such a slippery slope with bigot at the bottom, as Douglas Murray says, a bog of bigot at the bottom that you slip down to say, well, racism might be natural. It's like, okay, well, let's think about that. We spent the vast majority of our evolutionary history in tribes of 25 to 50, something like that, absolutely terrified that there's some pathogen 1 valley away that's gonna infect us and kill us, or a tribe that'll come and take all of our food and rape all of our women. Or do you know what I mean? Like,
it's extremely, like, whether or not racism is natural is kind of a fraught topic. It depends what you think race is. Some people think that the modern notion of race isn't something we've had for that long. But certainly breaking the world up into us versus them, and liking the us and really hating the them is natural. There's now tons of studies, including from babies, but also from young children, cross-cultural studies, computer simulations of biological evolution. If there's one thing we know, my field knows, it's that a propensity to break the world up into us versus them comes natural. So there's even these very clever studies. You get 100 people in a room, like you and me, and we all have a coin, and we all flip our coin. So roughly half is heads, half is tails, go into different parts of the room. Then we ask, so what do you guys think, your tails? What do you think of the tails group? You think we're smarter. And even putting myself aside, it so happens the tails group is smarter. The heads group, you seem to have like a bunch of dicks over there. Like who likes them? And even the most arbitrary ways of cutting us apart sets up psychological mechanisms where we split the world. And you're entirely right that it's natural. Now, of course, being natural, it could still be terrible. And so much that it's a bizarre fallacy to say, since it's natural, it's good. I think so much of what we do in the world with great success is we use our intelligence to sort of transcend our natural instincts.
100%.
We do this physically. I'm wearing contact lenses because my eyes are bad. We take antibiotics to fight infections, and none of this was natural. But we also do it psychologically. We also say, like, for instance, we say some forms of bias are wrong, so we make them illegal, and we try to work around them and so on. Some sort of, vengeance, revenge, the appetite for revenge is, I think, profoundly natural. But we say, don't have it, offload it to the cops. And, a guy cuts me off. No, I can't kill him.
Well, what about something that's very natural that would be jealousy-induced stealing? If you were to see someone else has something, why wouldn't you just take it? Like, well, I want that.
It seems that sort of impulse, I think, would be very natural. Yeah. But you can imagine, as we all get together in society, we all sit around, as it were. This is like a reconstruction of things. And you say, all that jealousy-induced stealing, we're better off about it. And some hands go up and they say, I really like it. And then you say to the person, okay, what do you like more? A world in which you get to steal from everybody else, but they get to steal from you, or a world where everybody gets to keep their stuff? And presumably people will say, on balance, let's all keep our stuff. Mm-hmm. An example I use in one of my books is hitting people. Like, sometimes it just feels great to hit people. I wish I could hit people. But my dislike of someone smacking me in the head is greater than the pleasure I get from hitting other people whenever I want to. So a no hitting rule on sort of flat out utilitarian grounds is pretty good.
Yeah. And then you have, I suppose, the social enforcement. If there's some people that are hitters and some people that aren't. And then the ones that are hitters get found out by the ones that aren't. And then all the ones that aren't can then say, you're one of the hitters. You're not allowed to be in our group anymore. And then it goes back to tribalism again. And we're in the them and us group.
Yes. Yes. I mean, so much of modern evolutionary theory and cultural evolution focuses on exactly these questions. So as you know, you can't develop a good society without some way of punishing people who aren't good. If we're all no hitters and you run around and smack everybody you want, your life is so much better than the rest of us. So we have to have some way of putting you in your place. And maybe we punish you, maybe we shun you. And then there's complexities. Like, for instance, suppose you do bad stuff, and so you should be punished. But punishing is costly. What do we think about people who could punish but don't, who choose not to? Do we punish them? And there's a recent study find that we tend to punish people who don't punish people who deserve to be punished. Oh.
It's so complex, isn't it? It's so complex. One of the things that I was thinking there, again, rolling it forward to sort of the real sort of worst parts of human impulses, is how the development of pushing people to have consensual sex and saying that unconsensual sex is something which is absolutely not allowed, because I'm going to guess that for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, that also might not have been the case, not naturally. And all of these things, you know, when you think about it, it is, when you look at it from a first principles perspective, it really is an interesting sort of question, a set of assumptions to look at as to why these things happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a general argument that Steve Pinker, many others have made, but Steve Pinker makes it in the strongest form, that in a lot of ways the world has been getting better and better and better and better. You know, you think the world sucks now, and in many ways it does, but I would rather be, this is the best time in history, take last say 30 years, I think, to be an ethnic minority, to be physically disabled or mentally disabled, to be a woman, to be a sexual, to be, and a large reason why this is so is that we've been better at working out the very problems you're talking about. We're trying to understand consent. We're trying to figure out how to balance all sorts of things, but also a growing respect for people's rights and autonomy. You know, when I was young, nobody cared about bullying. You know, just consider, kids smack each other around, who cares? And now when my kids go to school, people are just really concerned about it. They say, no kid should be bullied. And I'm thinking about it as, yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of messed up that kids punch each other and nobody minds. And similar issues about sexual harassment and sexual assault. I think we're learning to become better to each other. Now, plainly, there's a million ways in which we're crap to each other, but we're getting better. I think we're getting better in part by smart people struggling with these questions.
I suppose as well, I don't want to go down this road because I've swam down it too much recently, but I suppose that people who take complex issues like these, plant a flag in one side of the ground or the other and reduce them down to their most simplistic forms and then attach them to a Twitter bio, are really, really, really doing a disservice to the development. And I do think, as I've seen posted more recently, like within the last year to 6 months, concerns about where our real intellectual integrity and our real intellectual power is being placed. Recently went to go and see Douglas Murray give a talk with Lionel Shriver literally 2 days ago for The Spectator. And his primary concern at the moment is that some of the best minds on the planet are spending their time thinking, including him, his most recent book, The Madness of Crowds, is about this, about socially constructed differences between gender, race, sex, sexuality. And I do wonder how much further along we might have been in 30 years. Obviously, we don't know how much more time is going to be embroiled in some of these discussions. But yeah, when you talk about some of the things that you're doing, which are really uncovering the first principles of our nature, trying to work out real hard questions about why we are the way we are. And yet, some super smart people, Douglas, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, they get embroiled in these things. That one tweet that he sent could have been sent about something else that wasn't that. Do you get what I mean?
I do. I mean, you're raising a lot of issues here. So personally, actually, I find questions of gender and sex to be absolutely fascinating and underexplored. But I see your broader point, which is that, my experience, I spend too much time on Twitter, and so much of it is people defending outlandishly extreme positions, and then, a sense of ideological purity on both sides, very strong. And then, nasty attacks that don't bring us anywhere closer. And I'm kind of an optimist about things. I think outside of social media, there's actually some excellent discourse and progress. But for a lot of these questions about human nature, particularly questions revolving around sex, revolving around ethnicity and race, they connect very much with our identities. And so they're not abstract theoretical questions to be bandied about. Maybe nor should they be, because they affect people's real lives. I understand the point that Jordan Peterson was making about wanting to have the freedom to describe people as he chose. I also understand the anger he got by people who felt that their identity was being belittled by somebody who had power over them. So this is not getting in it one way or another, but these issues are, as you say, complicated. And to go back to what we were talking about, racism, everybody I know would say, oh, well, racism, that sort of in-group, out-group, is just morally wrong. It's morally atrocious. But other forms of in-group, out-group division, it's less clear. I love my children much more than I love you. More than that, I care for them. I would give them resources much more than I would give to you. Is this morally wrong? Well, maybe an extreme utilitarian like Peter Singer might say, well, it's kind of, it's human nature, but we could have done better. But I'm inclined to think that some sort of in-groups, like in-groups of family and in-groups of friendship, are actually intrinsically valuable. So I would draw a distinction between me saying, I care the most about white people. That's a kind of a crappy way to live your existence. On the other hand, if I was to say I care the most about my family and friends, that doesn't seem as odious. And what do you think?
I agree. I think the interesting question is, where does the group of family and friends extend out to? At what point does the rubber meet the road? Yes.
And our affiliations are complicated. I think we all have multiple ones. I'm a Canadian, I'm Jewish, I'm a professor, I'm a man.
You support a football team, it'd be a hockey team. It'd be a hockey team in Canada, wouldn't it?
That's right. Well, actually, I am wearing a Toronto Blue Jays T-shirt for this guy. No, if you got but we have multiple affiliations. To some extent, are harmless. I think sports teams actually just give the world more pleasure than any suffering. And sometimes they're when it comes to religion and race, they're the most serious things in the world. And to go back to it, we recognize it's natural. We should never, ever infer that means it's good. But it does mean that we have to be very prepared for an uphill battle when fighting it.
You're literally combating human nature, or combating what most people take to be natural.
Yes. And, there's different responses. So you mentioned Sam Harris before. So I do think there's a powerful impulse or set of impulses leading us to be religious. One way you could do is like Sam does, deal with it head on. Don't be religious anymore. It's stupid. Do something else. On the other hand, there are other people who say, no, we're never going to get rid of this. So let's try to make religions more reasonable, more kind, defang them a little bit less religious, more spiritual, tone them down. I think this guy, Alain de Botton, argued it once in a talk I saw.
I have, the listeners will be familiar. I've been reading his most recent book, which might interest you, An Emotional Education. And
thank you.
It is, I'll link it to you once we're done. It's absolutely fantastic. And very bizarrely, sorry to interject there, very bizarrely, one of the things that strikes me about his writing, and I went to go and see him speak in London the other week, is how I said I had crippling empathy. He has world-stopping compassion. Like that
Oh, yeah.
guy, unbelievable. His ability to make you feel, to not only show his own vulnerability, but to make you feel like the failings that you have or like the things that are going on are as natural as can be. It's just a really lovely guy. And his most recent book, anyone who's listening that needs something that's an easy read, but something that's nice and reflective, and emotional education, linked in the show notes below, along with all of Professor Bloom's books, of course.
Of course.
Yeah,
But when you've done all my books, go check out
that one. Yeah, for sure. So one question actually that I've been thinking, I wonder, have you considered why we still love people who have passed away?
Oh.
It's a question that got brought up in Interstellar. Actually, yes. if you've really sort of listened, because it's like 3 lines long in this tiny little bit, and they're talking about one of the astronauts is saying, I know this person is alive. They're saying, should we make the rational utilitarian choice about what we do with the mission, or should we do this other one? And they're referencing a tiny little bit of evolutionary psychology and a few other little bits and pieces. And one of the things that she brings up is, why is it that we love people that have passed away? I wonder whether you'd considered that.
Such a good question. I was talking to my partner the other day, and we were talking if she were to die, and I said in some way, well, I would have loved you, and she caught me and said, why the past tense? Won't you still love me? And I said, well, but you don't exist anymore. Can you continue to have feelings for somebody that doesn't exist anymore? I don't believe in life after death. So she'd really literally be gone. Maybe a kind of saccharine response, but one that might be true, which is, if you know somebody well enough, in a non-trivial sense, they continue to live with you. They live inside your head. It's not merely passive memories. It's a way in which they imbue the world around you. You often see this in bad TV shows and movies, of which I watch a lot of them, where our guy ends up talking to his departed wife, something like that. But I think to some extent they continue to live with us. But I haven't thought of that deeper than that. That's a good question. It's
a little bit like the character in your book, right? Because you extrapolate out from that character this person who doesn't exist, who actually never existed, but they live inside of your head, right? You think about what they would have done or could have done or should have done if they were in the situation that you're in. Yeah. It's a little bit like that.
Yeah. We our heads are populated with all sorts of people. And I understand this is not universal, but I do spend a terrible amount of time having conversations in my head with people I know, people I want to, if I'm experiencing something and I want to tell somebody about it in the future, I'll sort of be narrating it as I'm having it. So yeah, our heads are very crowded.
I agree. Moving on to what you're working on now. At some point within the next 2 years, there will probably be a new Paul Bloom book out.
Yes.
What can you tell us about it?
Its title may be The Pleasures of Suffering. It may be a sweet spot, and then a helpful subtitle like Suffering, Pleasure, and the Good Life. Mm-hmm. And it will be about why we are drawn towards suffering. And we'll look at it at 2 levels. One level is the pleasures we get from certain forms of suffering. So I'm thinking of sort of mundane things like we eat spicy foods that burn our mouths. We like saunas and hot baths and roller coaster rides. Halloween's coming, and people are going to go to haunted houses to have the terrified, to be scared. Some people engage in consensual sex involving some degree of pain and degradation, humiliation. Where do all those appetites come from? They're so paradoxical. There's not a huge puzzle. To go back to sort of things that are explained, somebody would look at you funny if you say, I wonder why people like ice cream. Mm-hmm. And they'd say, well, dude, ice cream is delicious. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not, the details need to be worked out, but that makes sense. But then you ask, why do people like eating spicy food so hot it makes them soaked with sweat and they're crying? Some people do. So that's half the book. The other half of the book is sort of asking a broader question, which is, what do we want out of life? And I want to argue it's not just pleasure or even happiness. It's a deeper form of meaning or purpose. And for that, suffering arises again, because we know we're living a meaningful life when we're suffering to some extent.
Why?
Because any project of any value requires effort. It requires the possibility of failure. It requires difficulty, often conflict, often anxiety. Having kids is the pure example of this, which is, you've got to be an idiot. Everybody knows if you're going to have kids, it's going to be tough. But this toughness is tied in so tightly with its reward. If you told me about something you did and you said it was easy peasy, no pain at all, no suffering at all, I would guarantee you're not going to take much of value from it. How hard could it have been? How significant could it have been? So I think meaningful, difficult life pursuits will require suffering. It's wrapped in the very notion of difficulty.
I think there's some really broad implications for how people live their lives there, talking about overcoming obstacles and suffering. Certainly, I know for me that when my life gets too comfortable, that's the only time that a little existential sort of tick at the back of my head starts to appear. But when I'm constantly working on something that is both challenging and worthwhile, that really doesn't occur.
Yeah, that's one aspect of what I'm interested in. So this guy, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, developed the concept of flow, which is what you're alluding to. And a flow state is when you're just really into something and it's just perfect, it's just right. If it's too easy, it's boring. It's just fun, it's boring, whatever, like watching TV, watching bad TV. But if it's too difficult, it's frustrating and you're just sick of it. Flow state is just this Goldilocks state right in between, where if you do it right, you lose track of time. The level of difficulty is such, it captures you and it captures your consciousness. People in these states say, you go for a long time, you're working on your book or some project, and then you forget to eat. You forget to eat, you lose track of appointments, you don't sleep, whatever. And that's one aspect of what I'm talking about. But you don't have that unless you have difficulty.
Because there needs to be a challenge.
It needs to be a challenge, that's right.
I'm trying to relate that to people that like to get spanked with leather things during sex and wear ridiculous outfits. I want to hear the flow state for BDSM. I was going to say sufferers there, but it's not, is it? BDSM fans.
Well, I'll make the connection for you. Actually, I think that
I cannot wait to hear this.
They're not going to be quite the same story, but here's a connection. It's not my own. It's by the psychologist Roy Baumeister, which is one theory of what goes on with BDSM is that it liberates you from your consciousness. So if you're like a lot of people, I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for you, but I'm in my head all the time. My anxieties, my nerves, my self-talk, my memories, my responsibilities, things I'm ashamed of, things, all the stuff is in my head. One way to empty your head of all of this is to get really good at meditation. And maybe after 10 years of meditative practice, you can empty out that head of yours for a while. But here's a way somebody could do it really quickly. They could slap you in the face really hard. Now, you're not going to like being slapped in the face, but I'll tell you, when that slap hits for a second afterwards, your head is clear. There's this great quote by a dominatrix saying, nothing captures one's attention more than a whip. And so the idea is, one theory of BDSM is that at both the physical level and to some extent the psychological level, it's an escape from yourself. it's in some way, it's the opposite of meditation. Meditation, you sit, you kind of, you're just stuck in your head, observing and trying to deal with it and like that. The BDSM, along with things like intense exercise, some drug experiences.
Extreme sports?
Extreme sports, yeah. I'm not a big martial arts guy, but the first time I ever did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm there rolling with somebody, first time in my life. And so this goes on for a while, and I'm like, I'm no good at it, but just, getting twisted into a pretzel by a guy. But I realized afterwards that during that, I don't know, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, I thought of nothing else. My head was clear. And that's, I understand, is what BDSM can do for you.
There's not many situations now, to the listeners that are tuned in at the moment. Think about the last time that you didn't have any thoughts other than the one thing that you were doing, or other than any one thing, for more than about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
If you held a gun to my head right now and told me when that was, I'd have to do a fair bit of work.
And so if you're ever fortunate enough to get mugged, there you go. Maybe you'll have that. Something now, obviously there's bad sides to being mugged. But
it's a wonderful meditative practice, though, of being mugged.
But the one good side is during that period, you're in the moment. And that moment of the slap. Now, there's all other things going on, and this is the case. Your mileage really may vary, but I did some rock climbing. Again, I'm not serious. My son is a serious rock climber. I'm awful at it, but it's the same thing. The mixture of fear, the need to solve a problem, the physicality of it all. You're not thinking of anything else. But you don't have that unless you have a task that's powerful enough to take away from your consciousness, to devote your entire focus. One way to do that is through extreme difficulty. Another way to do that is extreme pain. And that's what they have in common.
I tell you what, I did not think that you were going to be able to draw those two together, but you've managed to do it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, again, going back to the extreme physical exercise thing. I'm a CrossFitter myself. I have a lot of friends that do it, and the place that I see my athletes, my friends, put themselves into on a weekly basis, a daily basis in the gym, is Jordan, who's the owner of the gym that we have, and it's a yearly ritual that the final workout of the Open, which tends to be a very particular kind of time domain, a power endurance workout, which is like a sort of a 2K rowish kind of area, maybe a 7 to 10 minute or 5 to 10 minute just full go. And every single year it's almost like a meta meme now about the fact he's straight outside to go and throw up in the drain. But he does it every single year. He'll go and do it. And this guy is able to choose to put himself in that place in front of a crowd of people who all know that he's going to throw up, and he knows that he's going to throw up, and he doesn't do it at any other time. And it's this workout. And you just think, why? But I know why. And that's one of the situations I can say when you haven't got anything left. And there is something that's oddly so satisfying about that. So have you looked, again, to ask the same question, have you looked evolutionarily why that's the case?
The evolutionary benefits of that kind of thing, I have looked. I am not really that close to finding an answer.
I'm excited for you to find one. I think that'd be fascinating.
It's a great question. I mean, there's something else going on in suffering that your story's bringing out, which is sometimes it's social. So sometimes it's social in that you're signaling something about yourself. Your friend is signaling that he could put in all he has. That's something to be proud of. It's not a bad thing to show your friends too. You could be signaling your courage, your endurance, your piety. There's all these religious rituals involving showing suffering. It's meant to show your subservience to God, your love of your fellow ethnic group, your fellow religious group. So suffering could serve many purposes.
The Puritan work ethic, I suppose, like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you see that as well in the hustle and grind culture of young entrepreneurs now, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of Gary Vaynerchuk approach of sleeping 5 hours a night, and when you want to succeed as much as you want to breathe, a lot of that's signaling.
A lot of it's signaling. And then, of course, I imagine, in these communities, there's always a counter signaler. Somebody who says, look, I just got 9 hours of sleep. I'm going to work a bit, and I'm going to go for a walk in the park.
Chill out.
And what they're saying is, I am so good. I don't, it's basically the equivalent of the young.com guy going to a meeting, wearing a hoodie and sweatpants, which is, you guys have to wear suits to signal your wealth and everything. I am, and there's no such thing as not giving a shit. There's just signaling you don't give a shit.
That is a fantastic quote. There is no such thing as giving a shit. There is just signaling that you don't give a shit.
Exactly.
I'm gonna use that. You know what I think increasingly about as I spend time speaking to guys like yourself and Robin Hanson from Elephant in the Brain and Rick Hanson and a lot of these people who think about William von Hippel, guys that really do think about sort of why we come from that, and Robert Greene was on recently and this, that and the other. Increasingly now, and I wonder whether this is the same for you, understanding people's motivations with at least a little bit more nuance than I do, probably a massive amount more understanding than I do. I see people sometimes like WWE characters, they've got this persona that they're playing and this is the brand that they've attached their flag to.
Yeah.
And when you draw it back, you can see the lineage of why that happened, that, oh, well, this fits my particular ethnic group, body shape, background, working class, whatever it might be. Do you find yourself becoming sort of fascinated with the people that you meet and trying to learn their backstory and stuff like that? Do you try and apply a lot of the things that you learn to the people that you meet?
I'm really interested in the people I meet and building what you're saying. I think on social media there's a sort of narrowing down, a stripping down of people's characters. So people are always, without exception, much more interesting in person than they are in social media. It's not the same for writers, actually. I've met enough writers who I admire, and I kind of wish I never met the writer. I love the book. I like the books better. The books are such a sophisticated, gorgeous worldview, and you meet the writer, and he's kind of like a schmo like you, like me. I mean, not
like both of us.
Like both of us, perhaps. But yeah, there is. I think Robin Hanson is right about how pervasive signaling is. I think he's wrong with saying, and that's all there is, which he often says. I think but he's right to think that there's a backdrop in everything we do online and in person where we're not only doing it, we're also saying, and this is me doing it. I'm the guy who does it. So I tell you, Brexit frightens me. And I'm telling you Brexit frightens me because it does frighten me. I want you to know it. But I'm also signaling I am the kind of guy who would say Brexit frightened me. And there's that work. And for both those of us who are psychologically healthy, I mean, only the mentally ill or toddlers don't do this. We're social beings. So we are sensitive to how we portray ourselves. And you're right, I think that because of this, there's often a forceful oversimplification. One of the, I've had the experience many times of getting in an argument with somebody online or something and thinking, what a dope. And then you meet them and they're far smarter than you would have expected. And they're far more nuanced. And, it's, and in some sense, it's their fault. Sometimes people's, what they choose to signal is a sort of dopiness in service of some other goal. They want to appear to be true believers or morally pure or so on. You go back to the moral thing, which is you tend to get stuck up and think everybody else has a sort of set conventional moral views of a sort, whatever your community is. And my community is pretty liberal, so I think everybody has the same sort of liberal views. But you meet somebody close up and you become friends with them. And sooner you realize everybody has at least one way in which their morality isn't what you'd expect. They're extremely right-wing. But yeah, they're very pro-trans. I'll just tell you, I think they're trans, they're extreme lefties, but they hate unions. And, you find this. and it's always interesting.
Again, that lack of nuance in conversation is not allowing people to take their ideologies or their worldviews piecemeal, that you need to swallow it wholesale.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a shame.
That's right. But nuance, to some extent, isn't something that you could display in front of a largely unfriendly crowd. And if people are looking at you on social media, a lot of them are looking to watch you fail and embarrass yourself and contradict yourself and perform some sort of heresy. And so it's not a best time to fly your nuance. You're better in the presence of friends or people who you trust.
Yeah, because nuance to a crowd which is not on your side will probably come across like a lack of conviction.
That's right. That's right. A lack of conviction, incoherence, even saying "I don't know" to an unfriendly crowd is risky.
Do you think
apologies, by the way, are famously risky? Which is, everybody says to politicians, really, apologize, and then when they do apologize for the rest of their lives, they said, "Oh, he admitted he was wrong. It was important."
Yeah, you can't do right for doing wrong there.
Yeah.
I wonder whether, because it's a cliche now to say long-form conversations are missed. This is the reason for the podcasting platform taking this growth, because there is a hunger out there for people who want. But I do wonder whether it's less about the long-form conversation and more to do with the fact that it is a open battleground to discuss ideas without an audience which is there immediately giving you feedback, which immediately biases you towards saying things that might get a laugh or get a whatever, because you're still going to want that at least a little bit from the other person. You're going to want to say things that make you sound X, Y, Z to the other person. But I wonder whether the increasing popularity of these sorts of conversations online is something to do with the fact that it is this nice petri dish environment to have a discussion where nuance can be discussed in a way.
I never thought about that, but I think you're right. I think one of the appeals of a podcast is just listening to a conversation where ideas could be sketched out. And, as podcasts come in different flavors. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a straight interview sometimes where somebody, as it were, has a list of 50 questions in front of them, and they try not to be too obvious as they look down, and they do that and like that. But then there's doing what you and I are doing, which is just talking. And when done right, I think that's very powerful.
I agree.
The topic itself might be interesting, but I think you're right that more generally, it gives me kind of a warm feeling to hear people talk about interesting ideas. Like, this is how we should be doing these things.
I think so. And I think as well, as you've said there, and as everyone's seen online, right? Like, Douglas Murray has this line where he says, people can lose their careers for saying the thing, for not saying the thing that nobody said until yesterday. And
yes,
the problem with that is that in a sample size that's only 30-second segments, perhaps on the news, or that's whatever it is now, 300 characters or something that's on Twitter, it's very easy to take things out of context. Now, that's not to say that I've had clips from this podcast that get taken out of context, but when you spread it across the sample of a 1-hour conversation, someone can say something that's wrong or that isn't fully formed, and then the other person might press them on it, and then that allows them to, you know what I mean? It's less, the peaks and troughs are more spread out.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's another reason why podcasts of roughly this length seem like a good idea.
Speaking of which, that's around about the length that's right. So, Professor Bloom, let us crack on, and I will let the listeners have a look at some of your work, which will be linked in the show notes below. If they want to hassle you online and send you tweets that are 300 characters long, where should they head?
It's Paul Bloom at Yale.
Cool. And is there a website or a blog that you have at the moment?
Nah. You Google me to find my faculty website, but I don't run a blog or anything like that.
Cool. Well, Twitter now can be that, right?
Twitter is kind of that. Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
I love it.
Hey, thanks for having me on. This was great.
Man, it was so much fun. I can't wait. I know you've got, as you mentioned before we started, you have some chaos occurring on your side of the pond from like November 2020. But yeah, as soon as you've got the next book out, I'd absolutely love to have a discussion. I'm sure the audience would be thrilled as well.
That would be terrific. I'll be back.
Amazing. Thank you very much. To the listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, you know what to do. Like, share, and subscribe down below. Links to Against Empathy, How Pleasure Works, all of Professor Bloom's socials, and everything else we've spoken about will be in the show notes below. But for now, thank you very much.